We're here to talk about the talk. The talk, what Black mothers should tell their kids about dealing with the police. It's something that's very important in today's society right now, especially in the climate that's going on. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Hobbs, if you could, to talk a little bit about what the talk is and why it's important today.
Well, good day, everyone. My name is Dr. Tameka Hobbs. I am Associate Provost for Academic Affairs at Florida Memorial University. I also have the privilege of serving as the director of the Social Justice Institute that we have founded here. I also happen to be the mother of two young African-American men, ages 25 and 15. And when we talk about the talk, it is the discussion we have to have as Black people here in America with our children to make them aware of the racial dynamics that exist in the world around them. And I'm a historian by training, and it is no underestimation to say that in the history of this country, parenting Black children has always been fraught. Black parents have also always been the barrier between our children, our youth, and the anti-Blackness that exists in the world. And it has taken many forms over those years, during the period of enslavement, during the period of Jim Crow. Today, while there's been much improvement in our society with the expansion of opportunities and some strides towards justice, unfortunately, we continue to see instances and evidence that Black children, and particularly Black boys, I believe, are unfairly targeted. And so in our role as parents, the talk is really a prophylactic for our children to try to protect them from some of the worst elements of our society over which we have no control.
We're also joined today by by Melba Pearson. Melba, would you like to give a brief introduction, and then I'd like to ask you a question. So we elected a Black president and a Black female vice president. Haven't things changed? Why is the talk still needed?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melba Pearson. First off, I am proud to serve as Vice Chair of the Florida Justice Center. I am also the Director of Policy and Programs for the Center for the Administration of Justice, which is housed at Florida International University. And our focus is on data in prosecution and ensuring that data is used as a tool for social change and criminal justice reform. So, to your question, Jonathan, so many folks are like, we're in a post-racial society, right? Like, we had President Barack Obama, many of us were overjoyed to see Kamala Harris ascend to be the Vice President of the United States. But that does not help in situations like Dr. Henry Gates, who was I believe, a Harvard professor that was, trying to get his key in his door, up in Cambridge, whatever, and was stopped by police and had to basically prove that he lived in his own house, right? That doesn't stop, other violent interactions, let's say like what we saw with Philando Castile, right? I mean, that was, pretty much during the Obama administration on the cusp of going into the last administration. So the fact that we've seen all of these, amazing role models and a lot of progress does not negate the fact that racism is still alive and well in America. It just takes different forms, right? It went from Jim Crow to James Crow Esquire, where now the attack is on voting rights. Now the attack is on teaching critical race theory or an accurate portrayal of American history so that people could have more understanding and not have these very narrow-minded views with regards to people that look differently than them or live in other communities. So unfortunately, while we've had these advances, that has not eradicated the cancer, the disease of racism.
And so I'm just going to throw this out there. So we got a lot of response on social media for this discussion from a lot of people that don't understand this, or they don't want to understand this. And they say, well, if people don't want to get shot by the police or they don't want to do that, then they should just obey the law. What would you say to people like that? I mean, how do you deal with people that have that mindset?
I have to say, for me, the incident that still remains with me as one of the most chilling incidents is the murder of Trayvon Martin. Here you have a 17-year-old kid walking through a neighborhood where he had every right to be, coming back from the store, who was stereotyped, who was profiled, who was pursued and stalked by someone who empowered themselves. We can have an entire conversation about the construction of whiteness and white identity, and that does not exclude white Hispanics from the equation. But George Zimmerman took authority upon himself to proclaim that this youth was up to no good, empowered himself, self-authorized himself to follow this kid, and but for those facts, Trayvon Martin would still be alive today. And it is a tragic, tragic instance that reflects so many other instances of injustice that specifically focus on Black children. We can talk about Emmett Till and his case. He was accused of whistling at a white woman, we now know falsely, in 1955, which resulted in his brutal, brutal murder and before his body was being tossed in the Tallahatchie River. We can talk about here in Florida, the murder of another 15-year-old, 11 years prior to that, Willie James Howard, in 1944 in my hometown of Live Oak, Florida, where he was accused of writing a love note to a white girl. So you find these incredibly painful and difficult instances throughout American history that require us to do that. It is something that I have to do. It is not something that I choose to do. But if I send my children out, my sons out into this world unprepared for the way that this world will see them, I am doing them a disservice. It's not something that I want to do. I have watched with both of my boys as I've breached these topics with them. Each time they lose a little bit more of their innocence, and it is a absolutely crushing feeling. I can tell you, with my youngest son, who never meets a stranger, who loves people, who loves animals. We were talking about his experience when he was outside playing on his own. And he said, Mom, our neighbors had a turtle, and I saw that the turtle got out of its pool, and I wanted to go help the turtle. I thought about climbing the fence to go put the turtle back in its pool. And I said, whoa, wait, and this is a kid who's 14 years old at the time. Like, you have to understand, while I appreciate, your ability, your desire to care for this animal, you have to think about how that would look to someone. You climbing over a barrier, no matter your intent, is going to look like and be perceived by some people as you're attempting to break into a home. And that could have all types of disastrous consequences for you. And I remember the look in his eyes as he responded to me. He said, I have to be careful about everything. I said, you have to be careful about everything. And, and even recently we were shopping, and he was looking for a dressing room to go into. And he happened to go into a dressing room that was occupied. He was waved into one by someone. And we later discovered that the previous occupant had left their wallet, left their phone. And before people could get in, I went right in. I was like, hey, put your things, get your things together. Let's come out of this room. Make sure you leave everything just like you found it. The attendant waved it off. Everybody was all smiles, but I had to pull my son to the side and say to him, you got to pay attention to the details, because if something had been missing or there was an accusation that you had stolen something from his wallet while you were in there, it could have had all of these consequences. And so, these are things I have to be hyper vigilant about. My oldest son understands it thoroughly. He's lived enough now that he has come to appreciate those lessons. He's incredibly careful. But again, I think that these are parts of the Black experience that you would only know if you had to live them. And it's a privilege to think that these things are unnecessary. But unfortunately, our very long history in this country has taught us otherwise.
So, Dr. Hobbs, let me ask you this. When you had the talk with your sons, I guess before we get into what you actually said, how did you feel leading up to that? Were you nervous? Was there, what were your emotions like leading up to that, and how did you prepare yourself?
Um, it's the thing that anytime there's an unpleasant task that you'd rather not do, but you have to do, that you're duty bound to do, I would align it with that. I will also say that, I think about the talk. There are times that we have to have these discussions, but this is, for me, has been a lifelong approach to how I parent my children. And my first line of defense has been building a strong self-esteem in my children, built on strong family relationships, based on affirming them and who they are as people, as individuals, affirming their black and brown skin, that is okay and that it's beautiful and that they have all the promise of anyone else. The next layer of that is a firm grounding in the history of Black people in this country and around the globe. Again, as a historian with a focus in public history, my children have been dragged from African American History Museum to Black History Museum to Black Art Museum, and but they have grown to appreciate and to love and to understand Black culture. And so that, for me, and in my situation and my parenting of my two sons, has provided a very firm foundation for me then to begin to have these conversations. And usually it's episodic. It is when I observe them engaged in some behavior, or that's something that they may be actively participating themselves, or sometimes it's conversations and perceptions that I see of other people. And that's the other layer of this I hope that we can come back to, is the systemic nature of these issues. We're talking about the defensive piece of this, but we have to understand that we all live in a society where there are structures that are put in place that cause harm to young Black children. And unfortunately, it begins in our schools with heavy discipline, with explicit bias against our students, that ultimately leads into the school to prison pipeline. Those are real discussions that we have to have. We have to understand there is social science to help us to comprehend this reality. I think about Philip Atiba Goff's article, The Essence of Innocence, in which he and his fellow researchers were able to document that routinely law enforcement officers, people who would make up juries, and college students think that when they see Black and brown boys, that they are, number one, older than they actually are, and secondly, they find them, hold them to higher levels of culpability than they do other children. And so we have to get to the root of this, the systemic nature of these behaviors, so that we can begin to craft a society where the talk is no longer necessary. That would be my word. My wish is that by the time, should I be blessed with grandchildren, that there's no longer necessary to burden their happy childhood with these types of discussions in reality.
So what did you actually tell your sons when you had the talk with them? What were the topics you covered? How did you say it? And I guess leading into, for some of the attendees on this, and people will be listening later, what advice would you give them when talking to their children about this?
I think I'll echo what I said before about the foundations. That's critical. But in terms of the first time I can remember was with my youngest son. And he had a habit when it was time for him to go play in the neighborhood, he would stay until the absolute last moment, which usually mean it was dusk was leaving, dark was approaching, street lights was coming on, as the famous adage would come. And in order to try to make it home by his curfew, he would sprint, he would dash through the neighborhood. And he came home one day, I watched him from our kitchen window as he was doing this, and he came home and I told him, I'm like, look, you can't do this. And let me tell you why. Because unfortunately, you're at a size and an age when people are going to look at you and assume, as a Black boy living in this, it was a mixed neighborhood, but predominantly white. This was in Chester, Virginia, where we were living at the time. There are some people who will see you running and assume that you're running because you stole something, that you took something, or that you're fleeing from justice. And there are all of these other consequences that will come as a result of that. And it's not your fault. It's not anything that you've necessarily done wrong, but these are types of behaviors that you can't involve yourself in. And so for me, mostly, and I will say thinking with both of my children, it's come episodically, either behaviors that I've seen them involved in, or more recently with these tragic murders of Black and brown people, when we sit down and analyze the types of things that have gone on. With my youngest son, we had a very extensive conversation about the confrontation of the two Coopers in Central Park in New York. I believe that might have been last year. Amy Cooper was the white woman who became defensive when Christian Cooper asked her to put her unleashed dog on a leash while they were in the shared space. And we sat and watched that video of Amy Cooper essentially weaponizing her whiteness in a phone call to law enforcement. And I had to explain to him what she was doing, the way that she escalated the panic that she was experiencing in her voice. Even though there was nothing going on around her, even though there was no threat to her in that moment, the change in her pitch was to, in effect, create a situation where the dispatcher would be alarmed, that the dispatcher would convey that alarm to the police officer, who would show up at that site alarmed enough to perhaps take the life of Christian Cooper. And we had a real conversation about him. And I asked my son, well, what did Christian Cooper do right? Christian Cooper took out his phone and he recorded the incident so he would have evidence. Christian Cooper maintained his head and, engaged this woman, denying and refuting the things that she was saying on the phone. And so for that conversation, there was a bit more of analysis because he was older at that point. He was 14 going on 15. And he saw very clearly, what this woman was doing. And I told him that you may find yourself in a situation like this. So you need to take some notes on how this Black man was able to survive that instance. So that's a little bit more granular in terms of the nature of the conversations I've had with my two sons.
So, Melba, let me ask you this question first. We have a media barrage of videos of Black and brown people getting killed by the police, getting shot. Is this something that the children should see as part of this discussion, or does it just add to the trauma without any value?
Ooh, yeah, that's a really tough question, Jonathan, and a very good one. I think that there is something to be said for seeing these videos so that the children have an understanding of what's going on in the world. I don't think they should be fed a constant diet of it, right? So for instance, when we had the George Floyd murder, obviously that was a video that went viral very quickly, right? I mean, it was played on the evening news and all of that. I probably would, I'm not I'm a stepmother and my stepchild is very grown, so didn't need to have that discussion. But I think that's the type of situation where you may want to watch it on the news so that it's not necessarily the very graphic viral video that you might find on Facebook, Instagram, or on the internet generally. So that way your child gets an understanding and is seeing in real time, how this can happen, and the brave children that were also on scene, including the young lady that was 17 years old who actually had the presence of mind to videotape what was happening. I think there's a lot, like Dr. Hobbs mentioned, there's a lot of teaching moments that can be gleaned from the video. But I don't think we should have a situation where you're showing your child, those types of violent videos every single day, because then, of course, now it's adding to the trauma. But I think a lot of it is about context, using it as a teaching moment and telling them, listen, you don't need to walk out the door scared. Do not carry yourself in a spirit of fear, but just always be aware of your surroundings. And if something doesn't seem right, your gut instincts and your phone are going to be the two things that can save you in a situation, right? So definitely, keep an eye on, where the exits are, who's around you, how they're acting towards you, how they're looking at you, just be very aware of who's around. And if you get the sense that something doesn't feel right, then extract yourself from the situation and get to a safe place. So I think there is teaching value in showing the videos, but in smaller doses, and if possible, as edited or as censored as possible, so they're not literally watching, death on a constant basis.
Muted, Jonathan. Jonathan, we can't hear you.
Oh, my apologies again. So let me ask you this, Dr. Hobbs. When you did have this conversation with your sons, how did they react to it, and did they have any changes after that in any sort of attitude, the way they looked at things? What did you notice as a parent?
I will say that I can't tell you that I noticed any immediate changes in their demeanor. I think, especially for my children are different, right? My oldest son is much more relaxed, much more laid back. He kind of, is a thinker. He'll take information in. So I think he just kind of processed on his own and just developed his own personal self-awareness. He would come to me with questions about things that took place. My younger son is, again, very happy-go-lucky. He just loves people and being out. So I think he was a bit incredulous at first when I started talking to him about some of these things. But, most recently, I asked him about some of the lessons that he was learning by these things. And he said to me what he said as a statement. The question he had asked me previously. Previously, when I talked to him about that, he was like, you mean I have to be careful about everything? He said to me, I have to be careful about everything. And I was like, okay, so we're making some progress. You understand this. He's a questioner, so he will come and present scenarios to me and say, what if this person did this to me? What if this person called me the N-word? What should I do? And how should I respond? And I think he asked me the other day, I don't know what prompted him. He was like, what if some small kid called me the N-word and I went to that kid's parent and told them what they did and they didn't do anything? And, we ended up having a conversation about that, about, really kind of a sticks and stones conversation. It doesn't matter what people call you, as long as they're not standing in your way. That's not your issue. That really is more about them and the twisted culture that they're passing on from generation to generation. A lot of this also is about non-confrontation, learning that it's not always worth it, which is kind of interesting again for my, more excitable younger son. The next stream of conversations I'm planning for him is, as Ms. Pearson said, empowering him to know that he can always walk away, because he's a young man, and this dangerous combination of testosterone in young men, along with this dangerous climate that we exist in, is just a really, really difficult position. And there's so many young men of color who just act on impulse, who end up in situations that absolutely change the course of their lives. And those are cautionary tales. We actually have family members that I'm able to point to over the years who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, I won't call it a justice system, and who've been caught up on the wrong end of things. And so those, throughout their youth, we've had honest conversations about outcomes and the choices that lay before them. And again, the unfortunate need to be hypervigilant about all things in their life, because it all has really high consequence. Jonathan, you're muted again.
I am not a fan of teams. I'll just say that. Melba, let me ask you this. So what are some ways that a person of color could stay safe when interacting with the police?
Sure. So the list is a little long on that one. But so first of all, and this is often the hardest, you're not going to win on the street. That is the hardest lesson and the hardest pill to swallow, because especially when you're confronted by, let's say, a police officer. Now, keeping in mind, the majority of police officers do their jobs, do it professionally, and treat people with respect. But there's a chunk of officers out there who feel the need to abuse our community, and whether it be problems at home or inherent racism or implicit bias or any of those reasons, they are not treating and interacting with people of color in a respectful manner. So most of the time, if you get pulled over, you're probably going to be okay. But If you encounter someone who is more racist or more aggressive, whatever the case may be, now you're in a more escalated type situation. So the key thing is to always remember you're not going to win the argument on the street. Just comply. Okay, yes, officer, no, officer. If the officer's like, may I have consent to search? You don't have to give consent to search. If they have a warrant, it's a different story, right? But if the police officer asks, for consent to search your trunk, to search your glove box, it's up to you. But the answer can very legally be no, because that is your choice. They're asking for your consent, right? So keep that in mind. Also, if a police officer is, rude or aggressive towards you, first of all, always, whenever you get pulled over, your hands go to 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, right? So I'm talking about now, automobile encounters. I'll talk about if you're walking down the street momentarily. So if you're in a car, you get pulled over, have your hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Make sure the officer can see your hands at all times. If they ask for your ID or your registration, you then say, and this is going to sound very trifling, but please bear with me, officer, I am now going to reach into my pocketbook, or I'm now going to reach into my pants pocket, my left rear pants pocket, which is where I keep my wallet, and I'm going to get my driver's license, right? Because when you think about the case of Philando Castile, he was the gentleman out in, I believe it was Minnesota, who had been pulled over. He had a legal firearm in his car. Like, he had a license, a permit, everything, required by law. And he disclosed that fact to the officer. And when the officer said, okay, let me see your driver's license, he reached into his pocket to get his driver's license, and the officer opened fire on him. And his, explanation was that I knew he had a gun and I was in fear. So that's why it's very important to really set that stage so that you're not making any sudden movements, and you can, Lord willing, you survive the experience, you can negate some of that argument. Oh, I was in fear, I didn't know what the person was doing, because you clearly narrated every step of the way what you're doing. I'm now reaching for my registration. It's in my glove box. I'm now going to open my glove box, that sort of thing, right? If you are, if the officer is rude or aggressive or anything like that, if the officer is in uniform, their badge should be located right on their chest, along with their badge number, which is right underneath, as well as their name tag. Try to identify what police department it is that pulled you over, whether that's on their car, again, on their uniform, the name of the officer, especially if it's a common name, let's say Officer Smith, you're going to want to see what the first initial is. So that way, if you then choose to make a complaint later on, which I highly suggest that you do, you have as much information as possible to provide to the police department so that they can do an investigation and hopefully hold this officer accountable. I want to really encourage people to file those reports with the police department internal affairs division. Every police department has one, because what ends up happening is that many times people have these horrible encounters, and understandably so. You want to put it out of your mind. You don't want to revisit it again, but then the officer gets away with it, right? There's no record that this officer had this excessive or violent or rude interaction with a member of the public. And what we saw, for instance, as we looked at the Chauvin trial in his murdering of George Floyd, there were 17 prior excessive force complaints against him, and some of those instances were able to be brought into the trial to show that he has a pattern and a practice of being discriminatory in nature and using excessive force towards people of color in the community. So that's why it's so important for us to speak up, not only just on social media, but to leave that paper trail with the police department so that there can be some accountability later on down the line. When it comes to an interaction on foot, let's say, so person to person, if an officer says, hey, come over here, you don't necessarily have to comply, right? It all depends on the situation, because, an officer can come up to you and just be like, hey, let me get your ID. And you're just like, but for what? Like, do you have reasonable suspicion that I'm in the course of committing a crime? Do you have probable cause to search me? Like, what's the story here, right? There is, clear case law that says you can walk away from a police officer if you are not being detained. So the key question is always, am I free to leave? If the officer says no, then obviously they're detaining you for some reason, and you have that right to ask, well, what are you detaining me for? What is the issue, right? I highly suggest you do so politely, because again, you have to remember that you can't escalate the situation, right? It's already an imbalanced situation where the police officer has more power than you in this instant. So you having an attitude or whatever is just going to then feed into their justification to use more force against you. So that's why, and again, it's awful, it sucks, there's no other way to say it, right? I'm just being blunt, but the reality is you have to keep your wits about you. I saw a very interesting meme where it was basically like, wait a minute, so the police officer has a firearm, it's pointed at my head, and I have to be the one to be calm and they get to be the one in fear? Yeah, I know, it doesn't make sense, right? But the reality is that's how it plays out on the street. So keep your voice calm and just be like, I'm sorry, officer. If you can't articulate a reason for me to detain me, and if I'm clearly free to leave, I'm going to leave now. Have a great day, and just walk away, right? If you are being detained, then the question is, do you want to call a lawyer, right? That would be a very good idea from the standpoint of protecting your rights and also having another witness there for any questioning or anything that might happen. And the last point I want to say is that it is my understanding that a new law just got passed here in Florida that says if you're going to film the police, you can only do so from 30 feet away. Now, most of us don't carry a measuring tape around with them, right? But the key to remember is, yes, you are allowed to videotape the police in the execution of their duties in public, right? That is very subtle case law, but you just have to make sure to be as far away as possible. Use the zoom feature on your phone, or if you have a camera, use the zoom feature, but you need to be 30 feet away so that now you don't have a situation where the officer turns from whatever it is they're doing, accusing you of now disrupting their duties, making them incapable of fulfilling their duties, and now you get arrested as a result. So those are some things to keep in mind.
Thank you, Melba. So I want to make a little bit of time for some audience questions. We've been getting a few of them in. The first one is for Dr. Hobbs. What can allies do to help create safer interactions for people of color?
I think I'm reminded again very vividly of what we just saw in the murder trial and conviction of Derek Chaffin, which is it was witnesses and people standing and watching. And there's a 17-year-old Black girl whose video was the one that came forward and refuted the lies that had originally been submitted as a part of the police report. And so I think bystanding and watching is very important when we see these instances, and showing allyship with people who are being detained, being stopped by people of color. I think leaning in and paying attention to what's going on in the police forces in your jurisdictions, whether it's county, village, city, what have you. Pay attention to what's happening. Pay attention to the records, these cases, as Ms. Pearson pointed out, that are being filed with internal affairs against those officers. Can we hold our elected sheriffs and law enforcement officers to account in what they allow from their officers? Do the county sheriffs support and allow officers on their forces who have records of abuse? That is a very fair and important question come election time. I like to talk about the power of an anti-racist vote. All of these people who have a role to play in the execution of justice in our country, whether they be prosecutors, whether they be state attorneys, whether they be sheriffs and other law enforcement officials, knowing and asking and interrogating them about their views, and then holding them to account to make sure that they don't allow for racial disparity in policing or hyper policing among your Black and brown neighbors is a very, very impactful way that you can support them, because these things are systemic. I would like to go back to the previous question I placed in the chat, I hope participants can see it, a resource. I happened to see these pair of co-authors at the South Florida Book Festival hosted by the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in Fort Lauderdale a few years ago. The title of the book is Justice While Black. And it is a guide for families to explore in more depth exactly what Ms. Pearson was giving. She was giving some incredible advice for you, but it's a guide if you're looking for additional resources, if you're parenting on children of color, Black children especially. I recommend that resource. The other thing that I would recommend to folks, if you have not yet read this book, it is an absolute classic in my opinion, and that book is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. If you really want to understand the nature of policing, I will say for myself, it was eye-opening for me when I read it, because there were many assumptions that I made as a citizen in this country about the fair and impartial operation of our criminal legal system that simply are not true. And it's very important that we understand these habits, these assumptions that we make in order to begin to interrogate the policies. And that's something that's also very important as we have these continuing discussions in many arenas about racial injustice and social inequality. All of it is born out of bad policy. And so when we start to interrogate policy, you will begin to understand and pinpoint where things have gone wrong. But more importantly, it gives us an opportunity to correct and to fix the methods that are put in place for these issues. So just wanted to offer that.
So Dr. Hobbs, I guess the last question that we have from the audience so far is that for mothers and mentors of Black children who are not Black themselves, is there other things are there resources for them? Are there other ways that they can have the talk? Should there be differences? How do you view that?
I don't think that there's much difference in that talk, and I have some resources that I will place in the chat for the audience. I think Melba and I were talking about what we could offer to other folks later, putting together a little guide for folks who have more questions. I think the nature of those conversations are essentially the same. I think they have to be sensitive to age. I firmly believe they have to be grounded in positive Black identity and making sure that our children are confident and know that Black people have contributed great things to society throughout the world. So you have to start there. The other complication I think that comes when you are a white person talking to children of color about this issue is acknowledging some of the privilege that comes along with being white, that your experience with the world may be different, that these Black children may see you as a white person receiving different treatment from people, but sometimes because of the color of their skin, they may experience these types of things and they may manifest in these ways, and that these are the things that you can do to help understand that, because we really have to stop with this culture of politeness, this culture of silence, this culture of whiteness that we're not addressing and calling out and naming the things, the phenomena that are real in people's lives. And I think that that's probably one of the most important and most impactful thing that any ally, any parent, any person who's concerned with the health and safety of Black children can do. So,
Melba, to you, do you have any final thoughts, final comments that you'd like before we get going?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, just, thank you everyone for, tuning in, and I'm just really enthused and boosted by the amount of people who have shown interest in this topic, especially in the wake of what happened to George Floyd. I kind of want to ground this with a final example that I actually saw on Facebook, I think it was this morning, where somebody reshared a post where the person said, showed a picture of a UPS box, completely sealed, sitting on the front door of their home. And they said, listen, this UPS box is going to sit here until UPS comes and picks it up and takes it to the right person. It was mistakenly sent to us. It was meant for our neighbor, which was a block away. But here's our concern. As African American parents, we are afraid to send our son down the block and around the corner with this package and have them knock on the door. And the backlash is like, oh, well, you should get to know your neighbors. Yes, they should also get to know us as well. And we are in a time in our country, and we are in a place in time where we still have to think through whether or not we can do the neighborly thing by sending our 13, 14-year-old son over with the package, or is that neighborly thing going to result in the death of our son? And we basically sent him to his death. So that's why they were like, this package is going to sit here and we're going to let UPS deal with it. So, so that to me just really sat on my heart, because you think about the fact that you try to be a good neighbor, you mow your lawn, you pay your taxes, you do everything that you're supposed to do. But yet, many times in these neighborhoods, as I saw as a prosecutor, you'll have these, safety Facebook groups or whatever, where they're profiling people that are coming through the community and just kind of being cliquish and sticking to themselves and not trying to open up and welcome other people in the community. And that's a really sad place to be when you don't feel safe in your own home, in your own community, as a result of people's attitudes. So I just really want to leave everyone with that thought and know that this is a very real and painful phenomenon, that compliance does not always necessarily result in you living, but we have to do the best that we can to be able to keep moving through this world and to keep rising.
We have two more audience questions, if we could get to those real quick before we get going. The first one's for Melba. The question's from Angels. How can our youth and families deal with conflict, even violent conflict, in alternative ways without calling the police, who end up making the problem worse?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. There's a couple of different resources out there. I believe it's called the Restorative Justice Institute. I think there's one based here in Florida, and there are other national networks that specialize in restorative justice tactics. So basically, some of the tactics include, bringing together two people who have a conflict, and with a mediator, basically, or somebody who can play that sort of therapist role, help identify, what harm occurred and figure out a way for the person who committed the harm to, first of all, understand and acknowledge that they committed harm, and secondly, try to make the person whole in some way, shape, or form. So that's one aspect. A lot of that is going to have to be community-based, meaning that community groups would have to spearhead these types of efforts. There is a role for that in the criminal justice or the criminal legal system, however you want to view it. Other jurisdictions, especially in New York, have these sort of restorative circles. So rather than the issue going through the criminal justice system and someone having to go to jail or having to be on probation, this is something that can occur outside of the system rather than someone having to be incarcerated, et cetera, et cetera. So I would definitely suggest Googling some of these organizations, but I really would start with the Restorative Justice Institute and look at some of the models that they have and try to copy from that and implement it locally.
Dr. Hobbs, the final question from the audience is for you. How do we convince our Black children not to be scared of the police?
I don't think this is about instilling fear of the police in our children. I think it is, you start from a place of respect and helping them to understand the role that the police play. I have a healthy respect for law enforcement. When I dial 911, I expect the aid to come. But I also think that it has to be grounded in a reality that the fact of our experience in this country is that our melanated skin sometimes means that we get treated differently, and that you really won't know what's going to happen because it's individualized. We can't make assumptions about what's going going to happen. And I come back to that word, it's hyper awareness. You may have a positive encounter with a police officer, but you also may have a not so great experience with a police officer, but you have to have the tools and the resources to survive either one of those encounters. And so this is not about at all, I would never want my son to consider fear of a police officer, but I need him to understand that there is a world of possibilities that exist on the other side of that badge. And we all have seen and witnessed the painful instances when it goes the wrong way. I want my children to come home to me. I want to see them survive, and that is my only interest. And everything that I have shared with them, everything that I've talked about here, is in service of that. The bigger issue is how can we create police forces where this is not an issue? And that is actually embedded in a larger question, is how can we create a society in which this is not an issue? And we are at a moment in our country that, while it's been incredibly painful and stressful with the racial pandemic and the actual health pandemic, it reminds me as a historian of these other pivotal periods in American history where we have reinvented ourselves and attempted to move the needle forward for justice, for democracy, and for opportunity for all. The first time came with the emancipation of these enslaved people in the United States in 1865. We made some gains there. They were incomplete. We ended up needing to come back and having what some historians refer to as a second Reconstruction in the Civil Rights Movement nearly a century later in the 1950s and 60s. I think that we are now at a moment where we need the allyship that facilitated both the first and second Reconstruction to be brought to bear. The numerical reality for Black people in this country is that no major change has ever come when it's just us saying that this is what we need in order to survive, in order to experience liberty. It has been our allies in this country who are white, who have come from other communities, who have stood with us and been a part of creating a new society and new opportunities and changing those policies that have limited the life experiences and life outcomes for Black people in this country. And so my message that I'd like to leave with folks here, if you're concerned and interested in this topic, if you're concerned about the future for Black children, we have to continue to join hands to make sure that we're doing the work in order to prevent these types of disparities from continuing. And if there's anything that gave me courage last year, it was the multiracial nature of those expansive national and every state, even global protests where people will acknowledging something that is not controversial, that Black Lives Matter, which is simply a statement that we deserve the opportunity for life, liberty, and happiness in this country without the automatic presumption of our criminality or our guilt.
So I just want to thank Dr. Hobbs and Melba Pearson for coming here today, talking about this very timely and emotional topic. I'd like to remind everyone that the Florida Justice Center has a fundraiser going on now to bail out Black mothers, well, all mothers, but especially those that are disproportionately affected by the justice system. If you're interested in donating or learning more, please go to FLJC.org/Mother's Day. And we're looking to hopefully bail out at least 15 to 20 mothers by Mother's Day this coming Sunday. Ms. Pearson, Dr. Hobbs, thank you so much for being here today.